welcome home.
Thanks,
nice
Jeff.
to see you in person. How are you?
I'm doing all right, thank you. It's been a very busy few years, both getting caught up in terms of work, but most importantly, healing and taking care of my family, reconnecting with my friends, traveling around, finding everyone who worked on that crisis and who helped me get back to freedom, and thanking them personally. And I want to thank you personally for everything that you did, you and your team here, making sure that that story didn't go away, that people didn't forget about me while I was sitting in a prison cell, in a detention center cell in China. And I'm really grateful for that, and that's one reason why we're talking today. Otherwise, what I've been doing is traveling to the ends of the earth, trying to see some open skies for a change.
Yeah, good stuff. And yeah, needless to say, there were a lot of people who were very worried for a long time and are very happy to see you home. And it's actually crazy to think it was almost exactly 3 years ago, right? September 25th, 2021, when that plane touched down, you stepped foot on Canadian soil. After what, 1,019 days?
That's right.
In a Chinese prison cell. You alluded to this already. What have you been up to for the last 3 years?
So keep in mind, while I was detained, my partner at the time gave birth to our daughter while I was in solitary confinement. And so for 2.5 years, I never saw my daughter. So the number one priority I've had is being a father to her, building that relationship, making sure she knows that I love her, and helping her grow through the crucial years of her life. Doing a lot of healing with my partner as well. I mean, people forget when someone is taken hostage or detained or subjected to something like this, it's not just hard on the detainee, it's brutally hard on the family, who faces all kinds of uncertainty and pain and anguish from that. And so my loved ones have also needed a lot of help to recover. But now I'm back to work. That's why I'm here, actually. I'm doing some personal research projects, but I'm also back to doing work on the Indo-Pacific and on China and geopolitical questions for the International Crisis Group. That's what I've been mostly traveling for as well, doing research on those questions.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. Before we get to that, I mean, you mentioned your daughter. I hope you don't mind me asking, but in terms of that meeting, when you got home with her, I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
She was wonderful about it. So my girlfriend had been really good about that. I mean, her prime directive while I was detained, and she did a fantastic job of it, was to take care of Clara, to protect her, and make sure that all of the stress and drama and uncertainty of the world insulated her. This is despite the fact that they were in Hong Kong at the time, when Hong Kong itself was erupting into mass protests and then authoritarian crackdowns. But Clara, my daughter, has done very well. She's smart as a whip. She's super extroverted, warm and friendly. And that first meeting with her was one of the most heartwarming moments of my life. You know, after not seeing her for a couple of years, or never meeting her before, I thought, you know, how's she going to react to me? But she'd been kind of prepared that I was Daddy, and this is what Daddy looks like. This is the sound of Daddy's voice, because we had recordings of those things. So we bonded immediately, and you know, really very, very quickly connected, and have a very strong connection now.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. How old is she now?
She's 5.
Yeah, and how old is she?
Starting kindergarten.
Right.
So she was. My partner was pregnant when I was detained, and then about 3 months in, Clara was born. Yeah. That was not an easy moment. No.
I mean, imagine in terms of you've been through a lot of difficult moments, but in terms of reflecting back on some of that, and your time in captivity, the day you were picked up. I mean, when you think back to all of that, what stands out to you?
Just to maybe do a quick rewind, right? December 1st, Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou is detained in Vancouver on a U.S. arrest warrant. Canada arrests her. 10 days later, I was grabbed out of the blue by about a dozen men in black. They stuffed me into a car and took me to a secret black jail, and then proceeded to interrogate me relentlessly and hold me in solitary confinement in a system that is actually not even technically legal in China. And that went on for about 5 months, solitary confinement. And it's the confinement and the isolation that are really psychologically brutally difficult, coupled with an interrogation approach that is really just designed not to extract information, because it was obvious from the beginning that they were just looking for something that they could use. They didn't have any evidence, real evidence, that I had done anything wrong. They were going to manufacture it, and they were trying to crush my spirit and gaslight me and brainwash me into accepting their narrative and confessing to crimes that I'd never committed. And that was a really grueling process as well. So I responded to that by just, as you do when you're faced with adversity, right? I dug deep, I looked at what was inside myself and decided that I needed to learn how to manage my own mind much better. And I drew on Stoic philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, ultimately other philosophy as well once I could get access to books. A lot of yoga and strength training exercises. So I built a routine for myself where I would, because the most difficult thing when you're in a situation like that, you're totally alone. Sometimes they would leave me alone for 3 or 4 days with nobody to talk to, so that at the end of that period, you want to talk to your interrogators because you're just so achingly lonely. And that's how the kind of techniques they use. And so I decided that there could be no kind of wandering thoughts. I couldn't allow my mind to just go wherever it wanted, because that would lead into a downward spiral of depression and shame and grief and just a whole cauldron of negative emotions. And so I learned how, through daily practice, inch by inch, moment by moment, to quiet my mind, or to not have any wanderings, but rather to deliberately explore. So I had an exercise, for example, where I would remember my whole life, moment by moment, from childhood until the present day. And every day I would sort of have a fixed time, maybe for an hour, where I would, it's like, okay, let's go back to 1977. What happened in 1977? And I would walk through that in my mind as a way of having something to focus on and think about.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine, and I mean, you describe it really well in terms of your ability to, stay focused and build that routine, but even just to sort of hold on to hope in those darkest moments. I mean, what kept you going?
I think there were moments where, frankly, it was so painful psychologically, and it's hard to understand why, but they're putting you in a situation where you're just filled with so much pain and grief from losing your loved ones. Grief at the sense that the life that you had built for yourself as you knew it is gone, it's ashes. And you have to come to terms with this new identity that they're trying to force on you as a prisoner. I think a critical thing that I focused on, frankly, was, especially after March of 2019, was that I'm a father. I have people who are counting on me. And at the end of the day, it's a process where, unless you have a heart attack or something, you can't kill yourself there because you're in a padded cell and they won't let you. So everybody physically is going to one day come out of there, even if it's 10 years or 20 years, unless they die in prison. But it's, who are you when you come out? What's left of you? Are you weaker or are you stronger? I stayed relentlessly focused on the notion that I was going to learn from this experience, a basic Stoic principle. And one of my favorite lines from Seneca is, the thing that matters is not what you bear, but how you bear it. And I just tried to live moment by moment with the sense that I'm going to come out of here and I'm going to take care of my daughter.
Yeah.
And nothing is going to stop me.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember meeting you the day you got off that plane, and I didn't know what to expect, obviously, given all of that. But I have to say, I was extremely impressed that that's not lip service. I mean, you just seemed so alive. You were cracking jokes and full of energy.
I was very happy to be back.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's such a immense relief to be back in Canada, to be here home with my family again. I feel like I'm on top of the world. It was like I had been given a second lease on life, and I just had this amazing sense of wonder and appreciation of the world. You know, the beauty of the wind blowing grass. You know, it sounds very trippy, and I wasn't sort of delirious or something. I had a great deal of mental clarity, but I had for many months afterwards this enormous sense of uplift and appreciation for things, and I've tried to never forget that, and it's given me a deeper appreciation just for being alive, frankly. And there were times where I kind of descended into a sort of psychological pit of self-pity and feeling that, you know, the world has forgotten about me, that, you know, these governments, these great powers, they don't care about me. I'm just a bug being ground to dust in their own fight. And so to feel miserable. But it became quickly clear that my family, my loved ones, my friends, my colleagues, that so many people were trying to solve this problem, were working so hard on it. And it was a story of Canadians and our friends around the world coming together, not just for me, but to fix this crazy problem and to stand up for our values and principles and struggle and fight through something and not give up. And that coming together was enormously inspiring for me. That really meant a lot, to feel how much that was going on. These are all the letters. Normally I couldn't receive any cards and letters from anyone except my family, and even those it was very difficult to get. One day I got this little card from, and I didn't recognize it, and it was from a little boy in Victoria, BC. I've never even been to Victoria, and he was telling me to hang on, and that was one of those moments where I realized, like, geez, this is a lot bigger than me. If you know, this complete, and the fact that this complete stranger would do that, would care, after I had been subjected to the kind of treatment that, frankly, you know, when you've been psychologically tortured and abused and confined like that and treated like a thing, to be reminded that no, there are still good things in humans, that there is that kind of humanity and caring and compassion, that was really deeply moving for me.
There were a lot of politics at play, and you were sort of caught up in the middle of it. Politics in Washington, politics in Ottawa and Beijing. Yeah, how were you feeling? I mean, obviously you just described a lot of sort of positive energy, but like, honestly, is that in terms of, is there any resentment there too?
Yeah, you know, look, I'm not a Buddhist monk. I'm not, you know, sort of in a fantasy land about the ugliness and brutality and cynicism and, you know, self-interest that drives much of the world. I'm not naive about that at all. I work on that every day. What I'm most strongly motivated to do right now is to try to help our government and other governments, particularly those in open societies and democracies, to adjust to this world and to manage these challenges. There's a lot of work to do. We have a lot of challenges, and we need to move much more quickly and decisively to prepare ourselves for it. Canada had a holiday from geopolitics for most of our lifetimes, right? We were very fortunate. We lived next to the most powerful country in the world, right? The U.S. unipolar moment, and whatever criticisms, you know, one can level at U.S. foreign policy, and certainly there have been many mistakes and many things we would disagree with. At the same time, for Canada, it was a relatively friendly, benign environment, very similar culture, a lot in common, huge market next to us. And as a result, we didn't have to pay attention to geopolitics too much. We could kind of take it easy and focus. To the extent that we thought about the rest of the world, it was issues like immigration and trade and investment. We didn't have to, you know, and expressing our views and opinions on things, but not necessarily having to worry about actually protecting our country from dangers. And we're now in a very different world from that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, of course, and particularly as it pertains to China. I mean, just the other day, Canada's ambassador to China said that China is not our adversary. She suggested that, you know, relations were improving. I mean, I think analogy she used was, it was, you know, a red light. Well, you and Mr. Spavor were in detention, and it's an amber yellow light now. But she doesn't think China is our adversary. Do you view China as our adversary?
I don't think it's a question of Canada having a choice about that kind of thing, quite frankly. And it's not necessarily useful to sort of try to put labels on situations. But what I would say is that for example, that I would agree that that light is amber, but the likelihood in the next 10, 20 years of that light turning green is virtually nil. And the risk of that light turning red is very high. And if you're an investor, or if you're doing any kind of engagement with China, or doing any kind of business or work, frankly, that is affected by China, and China is so large and systemic now, it affects almost everything, you need to think very carefully, do you want to be in that intersection when the light turns red? Because it could get quite ugly.
Yeah, and I mean, on that point, I mean, when you say, you know, it's the expectation that things could get ugly, I mean, what are you referring to? What do you expect lies ahead for us?
Look, if you look at what China is doing, right, they've been building the equivalent of a Canadian Navy every year for the last decade. They have a 300-ship Navy and are building toward probably a 500-ship Navy. You don't need a Navy that large if you're just looking to patrol your own coastline. They have ambitions to project power across the Pacific and around the world. In my personal view, they want to dominate their immediate region. We are getting back into a world where certain countries are trying to create spheres of influence. China wants to become the dominant country in the Western Pacific and East Asia, and then from there expand its influence to become the most powerful country in the international system if it can. And if other countries don't try to constrain that growth, they could quickly, they could in a decade or two find themselves living in a world that is in many ways reshaped systemically according to Beijing's preferences rather than the kind of world that we want to live in. And the case that I was dragged into, I think, exemplifies a lot of that, right? It was a Canadian government that was trying to uphold international treaties and obligations and maintain domestic laws that was subjected to brutal coercion and bullying by a country that by a government more specifically, and by the Chinese Communist Party, which does not respect those laws and rules and wants to create a world in which it selectively ignores them, or in fact tries to revise them or pretend they don't exist. And that's fundamentally very dangerous for Canada. And the growing strategic rivalry between China and the West after Russia invaded Ukraine, when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met and talked about how we are seeing changes unseen in a generation and we are driving them. I'm sorry, if that didn't concentrate people's minds on what's going on, I don't know what will. And so what they want to do is make sure that they want their political model to be seen as the successful one and ours to be seen as the failing one. And they are actively working to try to undermine Western governments and systems and reduce American power and Western power, and in many cases engaging in efforts to capture elites, to corrupt governing officials in many countries around the world. I've seen this for myself in my own research. They are trying to undermine the liberal international order.
I want to ask you about, on the question specifically around foreign interference. I mean, here in Canada, we're heading for an election before too long. And, you know, a lot has happened on that file in the 3 years since your release. Reporting by Global News, Globe and Mail, and others, often citing anonymous intelligence sources describing this effort to interfere in Canada and in elections in particular. And now which spawned a public inquiry, which is now into its second round. What do you make of what you've seen thus far from this inquiry investigating Chinese foreign interference and foreign interference generally?
To put it simply, what's happening in Canada is in no way unique to Canada. It's a pattern that is being repeated across the world, which is to say efforts to subvert electoral systems, subvert democratic processes, influence political and business elites, in some cases through covert means, in some cases overtly, in some cases through propaganda and persuasive techniques, and in some cases through straight-out bribery, frankly. I've seen many, many examples of this, and it is part of, we need to understand that this is part of a systemic, structured, organized, well-financed campaign by the Chinese party state and also by other actors in the world to do this, and to do this deliberately, because they want to cultivate that kind of influence. They want to create a situation in which every significant country in the world, including Canada, will first look to Beijing before they make any decision and make sure that that decision is aligned with Beijing's interests. And if it's not, to understand very clearly that there will be potential punishments. I think Canada has not had nearly as serious situations as some other places, but that doesn't mean that we can drop our guard. On the contrary, I think we need to be more rigorous and serious about national security issues in general.
To my knowledge, I was not offered, I was not told, I was not informed, nor would I accept any help from a foreign country, whether during my nomination or my election.
Han Dong, former Liberal MP, whom, through reporting by Global News and now has come out in the inquiry, intelligence sources suggesting that he had a conversation with Chinese consular officials where he said, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, but that if they were to release you and Mr. Spavor, that would potentially benefit the opposition Conservative Party and perhaps reinforce the idea that a hardline approach against China is a good thing. I wanted to ask your reaction when you heard about that.
I don't know enough details about what really was going on there to jump to a conclusion, to be honest. I think, however, it is, in general, it is emblematic of a problem in Canada where we have been, I think, a little too lackadaisical about the possibility of foreign influence and interference, because we haven't really had to deal with it too much before. And I think there is the evidence that there have been efforts to do that in general is mounting, and arguably that not enough was done to address it initially. And I think that has a lot to do more simply with a political elite that are not used to thinking in national security terms and not responding that way. And so we need to be a lot more alert to things like that to make sure that foreign influence and interference are not possible in Canada, and that perpetrators are dealt with.
Michael Spavor, it was almost a year ago that he came out with his allegations against you and the government, alleging that you were in fact a spy. Your response to those allegations?
Sure. No, I'm happy to set the record straight, frankly, because it's really quite simple. The allegations are false, and there has never been any evidence of any kind presented to support it. And anyone who looks at the details and understands the context in China understands that it makes no sense. But we should also be clear, because a lot of the reporting on that, frankly, was irresponsible and highly distorted and got a number of facts wrong, just simply wrong. There was no actual legal action taken. What happened, first of all, we only have this from second or third hand anonymous sources. Neither he nor his lawyer made any public statements about this. It was in the context of negotiations with the government, in which the government had agreed to provide some kind of support and assistance for him to get on with his life, and he has suffered horribly. He really did genuinely have an extraordinarily terrible experience. The timing makes it quite obvious. The fact that we were returned simultaneously, down to the minute, and the Chinese made it abundantly clear throughout to the government officials that they were talking to that we had been detained because Meng had been detained. There was never a shred of doubt about that. Now, why did they pick us? Why pick him? probably because we were relatively visible and prominent Canadians in China, and the Chinese government wanted to choose people that would get the Canadian government's attention quickly and apply pain and suffering to them and their families, and they've made that clear as well. They wanted to make us suffer so that Canada's political decision makers would suffer, so that Canada would release Meng Wanzhou, and also as a message to punish Canada and to deter other countries from doing the same thing. It was a brutal violation of international law. But I think the main reason why those confused allegations came out is because what the Chinese government did, particularly the State Security Bureau, when they interrogated us, they subjected each of us to months of that kind of gaslighting, coercive, bullying interrogation. And it's like something straight out of 1984 or A Clockwork Orange, frankly. They are trying to get you to accept their version of reality. It's like trying to force you to agree that 2 + 2 = 5. And that may sound ridiculous until you've been bullied by someone into saying that for hundreds of days. It messes with your head. And I think that is ultimately the origin of the allegations, which, by the way, were not directed ever at me personally. He and I had many conversations after we were released. He never indicated any animosity or issue with me. The issue was whether or not the Canadian government had done something that had caused him to be of more interest to the Chinese. To the best of my knowledge, and certainly as far, in terms of all my interactions with him, they were open and honorable. He knew that I was a diplomat working for the Canadian Embassy, and he was meeting with scores of diplomats and researchers up there regularly. He was already in a situation where he was, the authorities in China were well aware of what he was doing. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a target of opportunity. To the best of my knowledge, he didn't do anything wrong, and I know that I didn't do anything wrong. I was simply keeping the Canadian government informed through diplomatic reporting of what was happening in China. And that there is a very big difference between that and espionage. And I think, frankly, that was the saddest part for me, and the most frustrating part of that episode was that then what happened? Chinese media, the Communist Party's media organs and propaganda organs took the Western distorted and confused reporting on that and turned it into their own disinformation and propaganda. And I think that's something that Western media need to be a lot more careful about and more rigorous in their reporting to make sure that we don't do things that in effect end up confusing our own public and playing into a deliberate Chinese Communist Party propaganda narrative, and that's what they used it for.
You mentioned you'd spoken with Mr. Spavor many times since your release. Have you spoken to him since those allegations were made?
I reached out to him at the time and tried to talk with him, but I think, frankly, he's very focused on his own healing. If he wants to talk to me, he knows where to reach me.
One other name I wanted to put to you is Hussein Jalil, of course, a Uyghur Canadian who's coming up on 20 years in detention, and whether you'd have anything to say on that point.
I think it's an absolutely tragic situation, and what I have to say is very simple, that China should release Hussein Jalil, and they should release every wrongfully detained person in that country immediately. And we should not rest until everyone who is suffering in those places is freed. Because one of the things that I was always mindful of while I was detained is that I at least had the hope of having people on the outside working and fighting to free me. But the vast majority of people, and there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, trapped in desperate situations in both secret and structured official jails and prisons in China, who should not be there, who are there for political reasons, for unjustified reasons, and their human rights should be respected and they should be released. And frankly, it would reflect very positively on the Chinese government if they would recognize that, that is the right thing to do, that they should release these people.
Do you think you'll ever go back to China?
It would be difficult to imagine that under the current circumstances, but I would be delighted to have the opportunity to eventually go back. I have a great deal of respect and fascination for many aspects of China as a country. It's people, the vast majority of whom I always had very good interactions with. I have many friends there. The fantastic food, possibly the best in the world, interesting culture, and many things to visit. So I hope that we can one day get to a world where that's possible.
Michael, thank you so much for this. Really a pleasure talking to you.